A man stole just an apple, but no one knew he was once a hero who saved lives. Not until his dog tag hit the floor. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to make sure silent heroes like him are never forgotten. James Carter used to wear his uniform with pride, a proud Navy man through and through. But by the time he turned 67, he was just drifting through the streets like a ghost. The same man who had survived battles now seemed lost among broken sidewalks and shuttered storefronts. After his wife, Emily, died, nothing felt the same. Watching her fight cancer had been the hardest battle of all, and this time, James couldn't do a thing. The VA hospital's late diagnosis slowly stole her away, and all he could do was sit and watch. When she passed, he sold their home and donated the money to the animal shelter she'd loved so much. Then he disappeared. Not to another town, not to a grave, just vanished, as if he'd become invisible, heartbroken and shattered. These days, life meant wandering the streets. He carried a worn-out bag over his shoulder, collecting cans and scraps just to survive. The folks at Marsh's Diner would sometimes quietly hand him a coffee or a stale sandwich. But most people looked away, because to see him meant to remember, and no one likes facing what they've chosen to forget. That cold December morning, James woke up with his stomach growling. He hadn't eaten properly in 3 days. His hands were shaking. Even walking felt like too much. Eventually, he stumbled into Paxton Market. Even the faint smell of bleach inside gave him some strange sense of hope. His heart jumped when he spotted a basket of bruised apples and old bread. Hunger was stronger than fear now. He grabbed an apple, then a hard bread roll, and slipped them into his coat as carefully as he could. He was just about to head for the door when a voice shouted behind him, "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" It was Mr. Paxton, the market owner. He yelled while dialing his phone, "Call the cops. We don't tolerate thieves here." James didn't resist. He didn't run. He just stood there, still holding that apple and bread. His eyes were empty, tired. Within minutes, a police car pulled up. One of the officers was Sergeant Derek Collins. The other, a young female officer, Olivia Ramirez. Olivia noticed a worn dog tag peeking out from under James's coat. She asked softly, "You served?" James nodded. "A long time ago, back when that meant something." But rules were rules. And James Carter was let out of Paxton Market in handcuffs. People on the street just watched. No one said a word. No one asked about the story behind the stolen apple. That night, sitting in the holding cell, James pulled a faded photo out from under his torn shirt. It was Emily, smiling at him. He whispered to her, "I'm trying, sweetheart. I really am." And as the wind howled outside, carrying flakes of snow across the night, somewhere, fate began to shift. The morning at Fairhaven Municipal Court was wrapped in the gray chill of winter. The lights flickered faintly, and every step that echoed on the old tiled floor felt like a sigh of quiet sadness. The hallways were packed with people, some hauled in for public drunkenness, others for traffic tickets. All of them looking tired, silenced, and hopeless. But among them was one man almost too quiet to notice. James Carter was being led from his holding cell toward the courtroom, hands cuffed in front of him. No one turned to look. It was like he had faded into the air of the courthouse itself. His coat was still damp, the frayed edges stiff with cold. Snow clung to his worn boots, crunching softly with each step. The guards didn't treat him badly. But the worst thing wasn't being treated poorly. It was being ignored. For a man who once served his country, being invisible was the deepest cut. There was no one waiting for him inside. No family, no friends, just a few curious eyes drifting toward the ragged coat he wore. James lowered his head and took a seat at the defendant's table, the hard wooden chair groaning beneath him. At his feet sat an old military duffel bag, the fabric worn thin from years of being carried. Inside it weren't just a few belongings. It held the last fragments of who he used to be. Case number 19 to 2842. The People versus James Carter. The young court clerk called out, reading the words like a script. James stood slowly, tried to straighten up, but his knees trembled. Days of cold and hunger had taken their toll. At the prosecutor's table stood a fresh-faced attorney in a sharp suit, Brandon Pierce. He didn't even bother opening the folder fully before speaking. "Your Honor," he began quickly. The defendant, James Carter, was caught shoplifting from Paxton Market. Security footage clearly shows the theft. He has no fixed address, no employment, and prior citations for disorderly conduct and minor offenses. The prosecution recommends he remain in custody until trial to prevent further offenses. Judge Harold Whitaker was an older man, cold-faced, but sharp-eyed. As he flipped through the papers behind his glasses, he hardly even glanced at James. To him, James was just another name in a long line of cases, until something small slipped out from the folder. A dog tag. The tiny clink of the metal tag hitting the floor seemed to echo louder than anything else in the room. The judge looked up. He reached down and picked it up. The engraving read, Carter, James L., USMC, O+NO religion. Something shifted in the judge's eyes. His brow furrowed. His fingers trembled slightly as he held the tag. A memory surfaced, the scent of blood and gunpowder, the sound of explosions, desert heat. And a man. Yes, that man. The man who once saved his life. Now sitting in front of him, aged and forgotten. 5-minute recess, the judge said suddenly. Prosecutor Pierce blinked, confused. The clerk widened her eyes in surprise. But Whitaker didn't wait. He slammed the gavel down. Recess. Counsel, my chambers. Now, James had no idea what had just happened. For the first time in his life, the system paused. For him, for the first time, someone had stopped the machine. He sat back down slowly, his eyes wide in disbelief. He hadn't expected this. Judge Whitaker walked out of the courtroom with heavy steps, but not before looking back at James one more time. And in that look was the first real eye contact James had felt in years. As soon as Judge Harold Whitaker stepped into his chambers, he gently closed the door behind him. The silence inside was a stark contrast to the procedural noise just outside, a kind of sacred solitude. He walked to his desk, but didn't sit. He stared at the military dog tag in his hand, his thumb brushing over the scratches as his eyes drifted far away. His name was James Carter. But this wasn't just some defendant in a case file. Years ago, in the burning deserts of Iraq, that man had dragged him out of a fire, literally carrying him on his back, soaked in blood. Back then, Whitaker had been a young lieutenant, half-conscious and pinned under a flipped Humvee. Bullets were flying. Explosions lit the air and one man had pulled him from the flames. Now, that same man was in court over a bruised apple. Whitaker finally sat down and slowly opened the case file. The weight of the years was right there, between the pages. 3 overseas deployments, Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts, PTSD diagnosis, VA benefits revoked, 2007. Reason, no permanent address, case status, closed. That last line hit him like a nail to the heart. Case closed. As if a man's entire life could be reduced to a few sheets of paper in a dusty folder. As if someone had shelved James Carter and stamped him forgettable. But not to Whitaker. Not to the man who owed him his life. He had to do something. This wasn't just a legal matter anymore, it was personal. It was about conscience. He picked up his phone and dialed without hesitation. Veterans Legal Defense Network. I need your help, he said softly. There's a man, getting buried alive by the system. But he's a hero. I won't turn my back on him. That night, the lights in the courthouse stayed on long after hours. Judge Whitaker dug through reports, tracked down old commanding officers, sifted through military records. He even called former unit members. Some answered, some were gone. But every bit of information confirmed the same truth. James Carter wasn't just a soldier. He was a healer. One report said, during patrol, James shielded an Iraqi child from gunfire. Took a hit himself, but had enough time to cover the boy's face. Another letter read, he wasn't just our sergeant, he was our teacher. Taught literacy after hours. Taught us how to stay human. Whitaker wiped his glasses, surprised to find them fogged. Every line he read brought James back into focus. The invisible man was slowly becoming visible again, not just in files, but in memories. The next morning, the courtroom was unusually full. When James Carter was brought in still handcuffed, he blinked hard, unsure if what he saw was real. The back rows were lined with 3 active-duty Navy officers, standing silently. Beside them, veterans holding flags. Some older men stood in full caps and medals, eyes glassy with emotion. Some had trembling hands. Others stared from behind thick lenses, too choked up to speak. This time, the defense table wasn't empty. A woman stood, dressed in a black suit, scarf neatly tucked, leather briefcase by her side. She held out her hand. Sergeant James Carter, she said, her voice clear and calm. I'm Rebecca Monroe. I'll be representing you on behalf of the Veterans Legal Defense Network. James's voice trembled. A lawyer? But I can't pay Dash, Rebecca smiled. I don't want your money. I want the truth. Just then, Judge Whitaker took his seat at the bench. He looked around the packed courtroom. In front of him was James's reopened file. He closed it slowly, set down his pen, and looked directly at James. Mr. Carter, he said, his voice firm but steady. This court will take into account your service, your record, and the system's failures. We'll hear from your attorney and any witnesses. And this courtroom will deliver judgment not just in the name of law, but in the name of justice. Silence swept the room. Rebecca leaned in slightly and gently touched James's arm. It's time, she whispered. Time to tell the truth. The mood in the courtroom felt less like a trial and more like a ceremony. The whispers had faded. Silence had taken over. People weren't looking at James Carter like a criminal anymore. They were looking at him like a story, a broken one, but one that wasn't over yet. Attorney Rebecca Monroe stood up from the defense table and looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, she said clearly, we're ready to call our first witness. The courtroom doors opened, and a man in a crisp, spotless uniform walked in. His epaulets gleamed. His posture was precise, still carrying the weight of military discipline. It was Colonel Eric Dunham, a man who had once served alongside James Carter, and who openly said he owed James his life. He walked to the witness stand, took the oath, and then began speaking not just to the judge, but to everyone in the room. I'm Colonel Eric Dunham. I met James Carter back in 2003. I was a young lieutenant, freshly deployed to Iraq. But the man who taught me what leadership truly meant wasn't wearing a rank higher than mine. His name was James Carter, and he didn't just follow orders, he protected people. He risked his own life every day to keep others alive. A pause followed. You could hear the quiet catch in people's breathing. One night, we were out on patrol. Our convoy was ambushed. Vehicles were on fire, bullets flying everywhere in the dark. I was trapped inside an armored vehicle, badly hurt, barely breathing. And then someone pulled me out of the flames. That someone was James Carter. You could feel the entire room holding its breath. The man sitting here today is a hero this system forgot. But we didn't. I didn't come here today just to testify. I came here to speak for our shared humanity. There was no applause, but people lowered their heads. Some wiped their eyes. The courtroom wasn't just a place of law anymore, it had become a space for reckoning. After the colonel stepped down, Rebecca presented a series of documents. VA records showing how James's case had been closed. Proof that his benefits were cut off due to having no fixed address. Evidence of his denied access to medical care. Internal memos showing how his request for psychological help had been systematically blocked. Each document landed softly on the courtroom table, but the weight of them felt like bullets. Judge Whitaker flipped through every page slowly. Then he removed his glasses. His eyes were just slightly glassy. He picked up his gavel but didn't strike yet. First, he stood and turned to James. Sergeant Carter, he said, his voice steady, but with emotion beneath it, that I don't see a criminal standing before me. I see a son of this country, a man of honor. This court, by unanimous agreement, dismisses all charges against you. The prosecutor didn't object. He didn't speak. He simply bowed his head, because sometimes being legally right didn't mean being morally just. Whitaker continued, the Veterans Legal Defense Network will file an appeal to the VA on your behalf. This court will keep your case open until the necessary corrections are made. In addition, you've been approved for a state-supported housing program, and steps are being taken to ensure you have full access to medical care. James placed his hands on the table in front of him, but this time, he wasn't looking down. He was looking people in the eye. His voice cracked, but the words were clear. I was just trying to survive. Rebecca gently placed a hand on his shoulder. You're not alone anymore. As the hearing ended, the room stood not with claps, but with respect. Some people placed their hands over their hearts. The uniformed officers gave James a silent salute. This wasn't just a courtroom saying case closed. It was a country whispering, we're sorry. When James Carter walked out of that room, his steps were still a little unsure. But for the first time in years, he was walking with his head held up, looking at people, not at the ground. When the heavy courtroom doors opened, the world outside was quiet. The snow had stopped, but the air was still sharp and damp. As James Carter stepped out, the cold no longer stung like it used to. It didn't cut it cleared, like something waking him from a long, heavy sleep. He was free, and this wasn't just freedom written on a piece of paper. This was real. He had been seen, heard, recognized. The bailiff, a young man who now felt more like an ally than a guard, turned to him and said softly, "You're free to go, Mr. Carter. Or should I say, Sergeant Carter." James didn't say anything. He simply nodded, eyes heavy with emotions that had been locked away for years. He was still wearing the same old coat, the same worn boots. But the weight he carried now, it wasn't just fabric and leather anymore. And he didn't have to carry it alone anymore. He had just taken a step forward when a voice broke through the stillness at the end of the hallway. "Uncle James." He froze, turning toward the sound. He saw a young woman pushing her way through the crowd, tears streaking down her face, hair flying in the wind. When her eyes met his, something long buried inside both of them rose to the surface. She wrapped her arms around him, tight, shaking. James stood frozen for a moment. Then slowly, cautiously, he lifted his arms and held her. "Ellie," he whispered. "Is it really you?" She nodded, her voice trembling through her tears. "I'm your niece. My mom Emily's sister. Do you remember? She always told me about you. Called you Hero James. After Aunt Caroline died, we searched for you, but there was no trace. We waited. I never stopped. I told myself I'd find you. And here you are." James looked like his knees were about to give out. He didn't need a chair. He needed a place to land inside time itself. After all these years, after all the silence, someone had called him uncle. Not by his name, but by a bond. Outside the courthouse, for the first time in days, the sun came out. Its light touched the snow, making everything seem brighter, sharper. Ellie looped her arm through his. "Come on," she said. "You're not alone anymore. I'm taking you home." But James hesitated. "Home? I'm not sure I even remember where that is." Ellie smiled. "Home isn't a place, James. Home is where someone remembers you." That night, James didn't sleep in a van. He slept in a real bed, in a warm house, with family photos on the walls, 2 towels in the bathroom, a working fridge in the kitchen, a folded blanket by the couch. Ellie had prepared everything. She even found and framed old photos of James with Caroline. He stared at them for a long time. Youth, hope, laughter, all still there. Within days, news of his story spread across the country. Photos from the courtroom went viral. An old man once arrested for stealing a bruised apple, now reclaimed by life and dignity. TV stations called. Newspapers reached out. Documentary producers sent offers. But James didn't speak, not because he couldn't, but because he knew words would never be enough. One morning, Ellie brought him a small box. "This is yours," she said. James opened it, and his eyes widened. Inside was a brand new Marine Corps jacket. Sewn on the chest were symbols of medals he'd earned: Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Combat Action Ribbon, and beneath them, stitched in fine letters, "No war is ever won in silence." It wasn't the most valuable thing James had ever received, but it was the most visible. Rebecca Monroe, who had stood by him the whole way, returned one evening and smiled. "Your VA file has officially been reopened," she said, "and they've issued a formal apology." She handed him the letter. James read it silently. Inside was a compensation check for $278,000. But he didn't stare at the number. His eyes lingered on the final lines of the letter. "This nation forgot you, but the voice of justice called you back. Welcome home, Sergeant James Carter." Months had passed. Fairhaven was no longer the same quiet town it used to be. On that day, children lined the main street waving flags, storefronts were decorated with ribbons, and people had arrived early, holding small American flags, standing shoulder to shoulder. Elderly veterans stood with their grandchildren, some wearing their old uniforms, others in suits quietly waiting. Because this wasn't just a ceremony, it was a reckoning. A large stage had been set up in front of the city hall. There was only one line written above it: "With gratitude for service, sacrifice, and silent heroism, Sergeant James Carter." James waited quietly backstage, no longer in a worn-out coat, but in a neatly pressed suit with his Marine Corps jacket proudly on top. The medals on his chest didn't feel like a burden anymore. They stood like light, finally reflecting everything he had carried in silence for years. When he was invited to the stage, he struggled slightly to stand tall. The crowd rose with him. No applause, just silence, the kind that speaks louder than thunder. Some placed hands over their hearts. Others bowed their heads. Everyone knew the man walking up there was not just one man. He was the voice of the forgotten. Judge Whitaker was hosting the ceremony. He stepped forward, holding a plaque. For service, sacrifice, and unseen courage, Fairhaven remembers you. When James stood before the microphone, words caught in his throat. But he didn't turn away. He spoke. "I've fought in many battles in my life, but the hardest one came after I came home. Because out there, the enemy is visible. Here it's not. Here, it's loneliness. It's being forgotten. It's silence." The crowd was still motionless. "I didn't earn medals for saving lives," he said, voice cracking. "I fought so the man next to me wouldn't die alone. But one day, I was the one left behind. Still, I held on. I hoped maybe someone would come back for me." He looked up, eyes sweeping across the faces. "And you did." Somewhere in the crowd, a child sobbed. A woman wiped tears from her eyes. An old man leaned on his cane, holding it tight to his chest. After the ceremony, James sat quietly on a park bench. Ellie was beside him. At his feet, his new service dog, Rocky, lay peacefully. The sky had turned lavender. Day was melting into night. Ellie handed him a small frame. It was a photo of Caroline. James traced the edge of the frame with his thumb. She was still smiling in the photo, young, untouched by time. "I came back," he whispered. "You waited for me, and I kept my promise." He looked up at the sky. The first star blinked. The breeze was soft now. It didn't sting anymore. Ellie rested her head on his shoulder. "People know your story now," she whispered. "It won't be forgotten." James smiled. "My story doesn't matter," he said. "But maybe, for those still walking the streets, still unseen, something's changed." That night, James Carter's name was written into the city records again. But not on a citation or an arrest form this time, etched into a plaque of honor. At the memorial in front of City Hall, a new name was placed: Staff Sergeant James Carter, forgotten never again. And so, one man stood up, not just for himself, but for thousands like him. Sometimes, a bruised apple shows how much a society itself is starting to rot. But sometimes, one man's quiet dignity can wake that society up. Because even the longest winters end, and even the quietest heroes are seen one day. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to make sure silent heroes like him are never forgotten.